So good morning, everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm Laura Jeffrey, and I am the librarian here at Wolfson. And today we're going to be talking about research data management. It's quite a content-heavy session, this, but at the same time, there's going to be opportunities for you to pause and stop and reflect on what we've talked about, and to fill in a template so that you go away from this session with a little kind of worked through data management plan. You'll obviously need to go through that in more detail, discuss it with peers, discuss it with your supervisor, but it will get you thinking about some of these key questions. Research data management means different things to different people, depending on your disciplinary background. And so some of this will be more or less relevant, but I hope, again, it just gives you that opportunity to pause, reflect, consider whether or not this is going to be relevant to your particular research project. So yeah, today's session is mainly kind of signposting. There's some fantastic resources provided by the wider university, and I am relying very heavily on those. So those come from the research data management team, and they've provided a guide, and I've used that really as my structure for today. So you can go to their pages, drill down into a little bit more depth on the things that I'm flagging up for you. This is really generic advice. As I said, you'll need to apply it to your specific context, and do make the most of advisors within your department as well. You will have somebody who's responsible for research data. So if you've got any specific questions, then please do refer to them. And it might be that some of the things I've said aren't quite as relevant for that reason. So the structure of today's session will be, first of all, just thinking about, what are data, what's a data management plan, and that's, as I said, that's what we're going to really focus on. We'll look at kind of how you're going to collect data, organizing it, thinking about access for you and access for others as well, thinking about issues of collaboration. And something else that's a kind of really key theme that comes out of a lot of the advice from the Central University is that your data needs to be accessible beyond the lifespan of your research project. You might be required to share it, you might want to share it, you might want to come back to it at a later date, even when you're not part of the university. So you need to think about all these future questions, which is really difficult to do when you're in the moment and looking at your particular project and planning things. But yeah, it's really important to kind of think of the whole life cycle of data. What we're not going to be doing today is looking at data analysis. So I'm not going to be looking at specific tools that you can use or kind of ways of coding or themes or anything along those lines. That will probably be more relevant kind of coming out of your department. But we do have a session coming up with our junior research fellows, which is mainly for scientists looking at their research methods, but that's an opportunity to kind of see how other people have approached the issue of research, the methodologies that they've used, the struggles that they've had. So that might be something worth looking at. Okay, so first of all, data. I mean, everybody produces data, irrespective of which subject you're doing. Sometimes it's easy to think of data being very much about kind of numbers, to be about graphs and charts, but actually every single discipline, people will be generating, creating data. Because we're all doing this there's always a kind of collection phase, a research phase. You might be observing, you might be directly generating and creating that data yourself, completely new. But everybody will have some data. So it can take any form at all. And I've made a massive list here, archival material, audio files, documents, experiment results, field notes, images, transcripts, lab books, might be physical samples, everything might be only available digitally. But yeah, there's all sorts of data out there. And I think one thing it is important to think of is it's not just a means to an end. And this is something that's become apparent really, very much over the last decade, is that it has value in its own right, that data. It can be an output of your research project. Lots of people are now actively sharing data sets. You can cite that data set separately. People might therefore consult it, use it in their own research, or you might want to kind of cite it as well. So thinking of it not just kind of as part of that process, but something that will kind of stand alone at the end of it as well. Sometimes needs a little bit of extra thought about how therefore you are going to manage it and store it and retain it and maintain access. So when we're talking about managing that data, research data management, RDM, as you might see it referred to elsewhere, that is absolutely everything, like we said. So it's from these very early stages where you're thinking of the planning stage, what is it that you're going to be collecting, actually the collection of that or the creation of that data, how you store it, how you organize it, how you share it. It's the whole life cycle, as I said. And there are some kind of key underlying principles when we're always thinking about data that it's really helpful to stick to. These were generated in 2016, published in Scientific Data. There was a consortium of scientists and organizations who came together who really wanted to kind of emphasize some good housekeeping, I guess, around generating data. So these principles are called FAIR principles, which is an acronym that stands for findable. So it's easy for you to find it, but it's also easy for other people to find it. So as I said, because it can be a standalone item, you can generate a DOI, a digital object identifier, just like you would for a journal article. So something can be referenced. Having metadata around your data is really important as well. So metadata is data that describes data so that you know what's in particular files, so that if you had to hand over a project to somebody else, they would know what was in there. So if you came back in 10 years time, it would all make sense to you. There would be a kind of rationale to what was in there and why you collected it in a particular way. The A of FAIR is for accessible. So this is about the formats that you store things in. As we know, things can become obsolete really, really quickly. So thinking about putting things in as kind of open a format as possible and not relying on proprietary software or things that you might have a subscription to now but wouldn't perhaps when you left the university. That your data should be interoperable. So thinking again about if we're collaborating with other people, is this something that can work in different systems? Is anything that could be lost if you try to open it using a different piece of software? And yeah, making it reusable. So having maybe a license, having terms and conditions around your data and thinking in advance, because when you collect the data, you need to be really clear about what you're going to do with the data in the future. It's a real shame if someone collects the data and didn't tell, say, human participants what they were going to do with it, because then that would really restrict what they could do. So it kind of makes sense. Yeah, everyone would want to kind of, in theory, keep their data in this way, but kind of why should we do it? And one point is that we have to do it. If your research is funded by an external body, there will probably be a requirement that you need to keep your data in really particular ways. People want to make sure that you've thought it through. And that's if you're putting in a bid. So if there's anyone doing a master's thinking of doing a PhD, this is going to be a really important part of that proposal. Again, if something's funded, it's really important for the public to see what is being done with their money. So like transparency is really, really important. As we said before, actually lots of funders want to make sure that this data can be used again. That gets better value for money, but it's also, again, good practice that somebody else could kind of take your research, take your data and put it to the test and find out whether it's reproducible or not. Is this something that they could test, or could they bring another angle to it? Or if you've generated loads and loads of data for your research, it's a shame to waste some of that other people could use that in the future. And that's one of the requirements as well, therefore, that your data should be openly accessible and not locked away. So I've put a link there to the Concordat on open research data. This was created by a number of kind of UK institutions, but again, just making things accessible wherever possible, that there's kind of support, in terms of legal and ethical frameworks as well, and that's something that the university is really committed to. So as well as it being a requirement, it's also a recommendation from the university. I've linked to the Open Research Position Statement there, which was created a number of years ago, but the university still very much sticks to. And I quite like this final citation here that encourages the outputs of research, where appropriate, the accompanying data to be as open as possible and as closed as necessary. So if you make the assumption that all your research data should be available, and then realizing that there's maybe some stuff that it's not appropriate to be available, that's a better way around, rather than thinking, no, I must lock everything down, and if I'm really forced to, I'll just let a little bit of it be openly available. So there's the kind of, you must do it, it's recommended, and then there's just the bit where actually it will really help you. It will help save you lots and lots of time. And I think this is the big seller for a lot of people. This is the carrot rather than the stick. It's, it's a good thing to do. It's good academic practice, but it will really help you find things again if stuff's really well organized. If you've really thought about all the issues or the possibilities in that data collection process, you're not going to get halfway through and say, oh, I really wish I'd asked people this, or I really wish I'd collected that data, or I wish I'd started that experiment earlier because now I haven't got time to do it, because you just perhaps hadn't quite thought everything through. And when you come to the write-up process, if everything's really well stored and organized and there's a really clear kind of rationale, particularly if you're doing a PhD, you might be collecting data over a really kind of protracted period. And while you're in the moment, it's really easy to kind of remember why you're doing something. But as we've mentioned before, with things like literature reviews, keeping that kind of research journal going to help narrate things to you in the future is a really valuable thing. So yeah, I think it will help all round. Everybody's a winner if we manage our data effectively. So before we do start collecting and creating data, like we said, we need to plan it. So this is the very start of the process, and the advice across the board is that we should start this before a research project. Now, I know that we've got people joining us or who have registered for this course who perhaps are partway through a process, and that's fine. But as soon as you've thought about it and realize that you need to do something about managing your data, then the sooner you start it, the better. There's loads of support available to help you, as I said, through the research data management team, and they can take you step by step through the process. They're also really happy to review data management plans, particularly if you're putting in a bid for funding. As long as you give them, a couple of weeks notice, they can go through that with you and advise you on areas that you might want to brush up on, or things that you might want to include that you might have missed out. So there's just a kind of quick checklist there of things that you need to think of when creating that plan. And that's what we're going to do today, a really light touch version of one of those plans. And again, this is just to make your life easier. This isn't because we're doing it to make your life difficult, but it will make sure that you've got the right resource available, that you've applied for money if this is going in for a bid, to make sure that, say, if you need to store that data somewhere really, really secure and that's going to cost some money, and make sure you've included that in your research project. You might need staff time to support you. It should make sure that you haven't got an issue with versioning errors, and that's a really big issue now, that if you use any kind of Microsoft Office tools, that they just kind of are constantly overwriting. So you need to think about versions, about how much you edit, how much you back up things. This issue of loss is a really big thing, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. You don't want to fall foul of any kind of legal requirements, so this plan should help flag that up for you. And as I said, it will make sure that you've got access to it in the middle and distant future. I think also it's important to think of it not just as a one-off thing, that this is a kind of iterative process, a bit like with literature reviewing, where you would never just assume you've done it all. You might want to go back and check if anything new had been published. It's the same for a data management plan. What you don't want to do is just do it once, particularly if you're working on a really long project. And then there might be requirements that have changed. There might be new legal requirements, ethical requirements. The university might have come out with a new position paper. Things will change during your research process. As everybody knows, it's messy and uncomfortable, and things go wrong, and you change tack. And actually, if the only data management plan you've got relates to your initial idea, then it's not going to be fit for purpose. So the Funding Council, the AHRC, have a really nice, statement here that just essentially says that you've got to kind of keep it up to date. You should revisit this every year, or if you've got a shorter project, every couple of months, just checking that it's still relevant to the research that you are doing. So what we're going to do is start by having a go at filling something in. So what I will do is stop sharing. Actually, no, let's just click on that. And hopefully that's opened up for you. So this takes you to the research, the Wolfson College LibGuide, which is something that we use for all of our areas of support, whether that's managing your references or note making or time management. But we also have a section on research data management. And so lots of the tips that I'm talking about today will be on there. There's little videos as well. But if you scroll down to try it out, there's a tab there called Getting Started with Your Data Management Plan. And in that, there's a link to a simple DMP. But what I'm going to do is stick this in the link into the chat as well. So that's the direct link to a document. And that should take you to a really simple template. Just shout if it's not. It's just a single piece of A4. Hopefully, as you type in, it's going to get longer and longer. But at the very top of that, in the first box, it says, what types of research data are you working with or going to be working with? So just take a couple of minutes to think about that. What sort of data will you be generating or creating or gathering during your process? Yeah, so I'll just pause for a couple of minutes and give you a chance to fill in that first box, but we'll slowly work our way through the others, so you don't need to look ahead too far. Okay, so in the chat we've got a comment about the types of data that people are going to be collecting. So we've got transcripts from semi-structured interviews and survey results. So a kind of potentially a mix there of qualitative and quantitative. Georgina's got Teams calls, transcripts, email correspondence, notes, yep, from meetings, diagrams, models. Absolutely. So a kind of variety, and I think that's the first thing, is recognizing that you're going to have several different types of data, that there's not necessarily just going to be one form, and therefore each one might need dealing with in a slightly different way, and certainly managing in a slightly different way as well. Thanks, Nikhil, for the comment. Yep, gaps in your own thinking. There might be, there might not be, but I think, yeah, it's helpful to start thinking that through straight away from the process. Thanks. Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide. And this is, another really useful thing, I think, isn't it, when you're doing your research, when you're doing the kind of literature phase of research as well, is to just kind of pay attention to people's methodologies and just to kind of just make a mental check and think, oh, actually, is that something I could use? Or is that a way that I could interrogate my data as well? So we're now going to look at data that's very much linked to kind of human subjects, to think about issues around personal data, sensitive data, and the impact on that of GDPR, intellectual property, and freedom of information as well. So these are kind of big questions that a lot of people have. I definitely don't have all the answers, but hopefully can kind of flag up some of the considerations that you might need to think about. So GDPR, dated in 2021, and kind of what this does is it just lays out a series of expectations about how we're actually going to process any personal data that we collect. And this is, giving individuals certain rights in terms of what's going to be done with their data, but also kind of obligations on you as a researcher as well. Um, so really important things that you must understand from the beginning, kind of community knowing and communicating that sort of legal basis for which you're going to be collecting and using data, being really open with your data subjects about what you're going to do with your data, how you're going to process it, how you're going to keep it, considering all the ethical risks for how you're going to process it, make sure that's a fair process. Georgina, you mentioned that there's kind of a process you're going through at the moment. So thinking about kind of the institutional requirements upon you, what sort of processes are involved, if there's a kind of ethical review that you need to kind of go through. So yeah, thinking about all these different obligations on you as a researcher, and the rights of the individual that you are getting that data from. Occasionally there can be exemptions as long as safeguards are in place, if you're doing it for research purposes. So that's something that might be worth looking into. And of course, the kind of flip side of this isn't only what you're going to do and how you're going to look after it, it's if something goes wrong as well. And there are, again, requirements on you as a researcher that if there has been a data breach, there will be a data protection officer nominated within your department. There is also someone in Wolfson who is our bursar. So you need to kind of think if there's a data breach, making sure that's reported really quickly. Yeah, I think I would advise that, Georgina. The question is, if you're working with participants outside the UK who aren't subject to the same level of legislation, do you need to kind of comply with UK GDPR regulation, or would you go with a kind of host country? I would assume you would go with the highest one, that there will be requirements on you because the data will be held in this country, that if there was a data breach, again, that might be within this country. So that's definitely worth double checking, and I don't know the exact answer on that, but yes, my assumption would be that where possible you go with the kind of highest level of protection. Oops, sorry. I think also it's important to remember this point that your participants can request the right to be forgotten as part of GDPR regulations. So they might take part really freely, you might explain the whole system, and you might think, okay, this person's agreed and that's it. But during the research process, somebody can change their mind. So you need to have a mechanism for letting you know that, and you need to have really good mechanism for deleting that data and making sure that's kind of across the board. And especially once you get to the kind of analysis phase and the data might not just sit in a single location, you might just need to have mechanisms for kind of tracing those participants really, really clearly. So yeah, imagine a worst case scenario and then kind of work backwards and think, okay, if that was going to happen, how on earth would I be able to trace this data? So there is lots, again, of university guidance. So everything is hyperlinked within these slides, which I'm going to share after today's presentation if you need to follow this up in a bit more detail. So the first question is, will your data fall into these categories of personal and sensitive data? And it may not, and in which case you can kind of skip over this section. But if you do, you do need to think about kind of really whether or not you need to collect it in the first place. So again, there are requirements on you if you're collecting things that identify you, identify your participants as a living individual. Do you really need to know that? Would it be enough just to anonymize them, or what if that contextual data is really helpful, or are you just collecting that for the sake of it just in case? And I think that's again something the research data management plan does, is it stops it being, well, I don't really know what I'm going to do with this, so I'll just get it all. But then there's huge obligation on you if you're collecting people's sensitive data. So if you do have to collect it and you're really sure it's going to add value to your research project, just making sure that you get informed consent, that is written, that you've got a record of that consent. It's not just enough to have verbal consent. Think about what you're going to do with that data. Like we said, are you going to want to publish this? Are you going to want to share this data in the long run? And doing all that you can to make sure that you're not identifying an individual again. So if there's ways that you can kind of mitigate risk there, so anonymizing your data, removing anything that would identify somebody. If you know that you've got really low count of people who might identify in a certain way or might be taking, from my perspective, if I was looking at our undergraduate population, we have such small numbers taking each course. If I said a first year theology student, it would be immediately identifiable as an individual. So are there ways that I could kind of aggregate my results and say a first year arts and humanities student, and then it might not be so identifiable. Yeah, thinking about the security, if you've got personal sensitive data, how long you're going to need to keep it. And there's, yeah, a really nice kind of, well, it's called a flowchart. It doesn't look like a flowchart. It's just a kind of very long document. But there is, again, these kind of sources of support to kind of help you step by step through this process. How do you document consent? You will need some sort of information sheet up front to tell your participants what's going to be involved in the process, and then the consent form is a kind of separate part to that. So if you're using human data subjects, then yeah, making sure that you've got these two different documents. So one would really explain everything that's going on, what you're going to do with it. The other one is the bit that they're actually going to sign. And remembering that, of course, you might need extra safeguards if you're using audiovisual material rather than just written material, if it's medical research, if it's research for children. So just kind of taking a point and stopping and thinking. Sorry, Georgina's flag. I would recommend having them in separate documents. You might want to check this, but the reason for that would be that you would want your data subjects to go away with the information. They should be able to take that away with them, particularly that right to be withdrawn. They're going to need to know how to do that after the event, whereas the consent form, obviously, you're going to need to keep. So I would recommend something that they can kind of keep, or maybe you email it to them. If it's happening online, there might be things, but if done electronically, as long as if they get a copy, then yeah, I guess that's fine. But I think it's really important that they've got something kind of separate to the document that you've got as well. Um, yeah, and I think a lot of people will say this, oh, I'm only going to use the data for the purposes of this research and it won't be shared outside, my master's thesis. Again, don't promise that. If there's ever a chance that you might want to publish this or work on it for a PhD at a later date or whatever, if it becomes a problem, then you might think, okay, I'm going to have to limit my aspirations of what I can do with this data. But I would think big in the first instance, and then perhaps be guided by the response that you might get as to kind of what you can do with it. Um, so intellectual property, this is obviously slightly different. This is in terms of data you're producing and what you can do with it after the event, and particularly if you're having kind of unique ideas that might have some kind of commercial application, you need to kind of consider this as well. Again, there's all these sorts of limitations that it might put on your research if you haven't thought about this. And one of the biggest issues is around funder requirements, that if a funder requires you to make something open access, but you want to impose a patent on it, there are exceptions and there are ways around that. But again, that's really important to think about at the start of the process. Again, not promising that you're going to make something open access when actually you want to put an embargo on it for a couple of years because you're working through some kind of commercial process. Generally, again, so the university has its own policy that does say that externally funded research can be used for the benefit of wider society, but it also recognizes that if you're kind of an inventor, if you've come up with some kind of unique product or idea, that you can be rewarded for that. So there's protection for you as a researcher, so that's another reason to think about it. But then there's also kind of the issue of kind of how it can more broadly benefit society. And then freedom of information does feed into this because, again, it's about you need to protect what you've generated, but also balance that alongside the right that the public have a right to ask what is being done with public money. So if this has been funded by one of the key research bodies in the UK, then there might be a request put on that. So just making sure that you've got those safeguards in place, that you would have exemptions put in place if you need to. Okay, so this is another opportunity to stop and pause and to think about collecting personal and sensitive data. Um, do you actually need to do this? Is this something that's going to be really important to you? And it might be, and that's fine, but we just need to think about the safeguards that are in place. And then how will you think about making sure that it's transparent, that there might be issues around identifying individuals, that you're going to store it securely, and we'll look at secure data, excuse me, we'll need to think about the levels of kind of risk and how secure you need to keep that data. And there's different types of software. There's different places that you can store that data. So if it's really kind of high risk data, really personal medical data, for example, there's certain software that you could use and certain kind of cloud services. And if it's less high risk, then there's other resources that you can tap into, and there's a really nice chart on the UIS. So we'll think actually about the kind of hardware and software behind that in a moment, but just at the moment thinking about what you're going to be collecting. And if you want me to stick any of the links in the chat from any of those slides for you just to follow up now, I can do that as well. it's made me realize how many links we have in these slides. So I put a few in the chat. Working back from the bottom, we've got one about documenting consent, so issues around that. Then there's the ethics flowchart. Again, research ethics at the university and how you might to consider those. I think documenting consents come through twice. Let's have a look. Yeah, dealing with personal data, research integrity, and that first one, let's have a look, what have I put that one to? Data protection provisions and topics. So there's all sorts of things there about the legal basis for processing special category personal data, privacy notices, data quality. So the information compliance link, which is the first one there, has got loads of information, the kind of technical information on that. But I'll just scroll back and look at some of the questions. If you need to store email addresses and names to get back to people after the interview, presumably that's classed as sensitive. Yeah, I suppose in terms of the fact that, yes, if somebody got hold of that data, being able to contact them. So yes, I would have thought, having somebody's name. And I think weirdly, I skipped over one slide. I don't know how that happened. But just to kind of go back to that in the presentation. So personal data is defined as anything which reveals the identity of a living person. So yeah, by having a name and an email address, that pretty much identifies a person, because any one of those in and of themselves don't necessarily do that. A name could be, two people could have the same name, but the minute you have multiple categories of personal data, such as a home address and a name, then we can kind of drill it down to an individual person. Sensitive data, there are actual kind of legally special data, sensitive data falls under a number of kind of categories, and there's a link there to that as well. So it's racial or ethnic origin, political opinions, religious and philosophical beliefs, trade union membership, genetic data, biometric data, health data, sexual life or orientation. So like a name or an email address isn't sensitive data, but I do think you need to think about what happens if somebody gets hold of that and being able to contact people. So that is actually kind of personal data. I think it's also, yeah, I've just noticed there as well, under the kind of sensitive data, criminal offences afforded similar protection under legislation, even though they're not classified as kind of one of the sensitive data categories. So yeah, it's sensitive legally falls into one of these categories, but I would consider, yeah, anything that would mean that somebody could potentially be contacted. We need to just take extra care over kind of how you're going to manage that and safeguard that data, if that makes sense. So as I said, there's a huge amount of information in today's presentation, and I don't expect you to be able to know straight away from this, how you're going to ensure that your data is collected transparently. But yeah, hopefully some of these links you can follow up in a little bit more detail. And I think things like that documenting consent webpage from the UK Data Service is really, really helpful in stepping you through these processes, making sure that you feel really confident in terms of generating all the documentation that you need to when you go out to collect data. Okay, so moving on to the next section, is beginning to think about how we're actually going to kind of store that data, the formats that we're going to have it in. And I think wherever possible, making it kind of as easy for you to find it again, for you to be able to access it in different formats, to not be reliant on particular software, or if you've got to use software for your data analysis, thinking about ways that you can kind of pull it out of that data, that software, into an easily readable form. It's something that I'm always thinking about in terms of if we're generating any documentation, within the library, that if I was to leave and my colleagues were to leave, would somebody able to just be able to step in and just start editing things and not be reliant on kind of learning a way of using a piece of software in order to get the most out of it. So yeah, as I said, will you use the same format for your analysis as for archiving, thinking about how you work with the data now, but also how you work with it in the future. There will be particular formats that you'll want to use, and that's definitely worth something about speaking to your peers within the department, talking to supervisors. If you do need specific software, then think about applying for money for that. Again, that's why we always recommend doing this almost before you start a project, because particularly for a PhD, if there's something you'd be really reliant on for a year, you need to make sure you've got funding built in for that. And as I've mentioned already, this idea of having some, metadata, having something that you can often just like a TXT file, a README file that's just really easy, that you've annotated your thoughts, issues around access, date stamping things, anything that's in there that just acts as like an instruction booklet, I guess, at the top of your folder, have a README file, and then that will explain what is held within that particular folder, which I think is good practice for any folders anyway. It may be that there aren't disciplinary standards, that there's not a particular way of storing your data. So the link here, again, to the UK Data Service, includes all this information that I've just popped into this slide here. So there are different file types that are most easily accessible or transferable, or that we don't have to worry about going obsolete. And that's, for different types of data, whether it's textual, tabular, whether it's for images, audio files. And increasingly, there are kind of these open formats being able to use. And it's interesting, I noticed that on Microsoft last week. For some reason, whenever I went to save a new file, it was trying to save it in an open document format, rather than trying to save it as a Word document. So I think something had switched there, but actually that's kind of important, isn't it? Because you might be working on a Mac, or you might be working on a PC, and it isn't always the case that things are easily transferable between the two. So yeah, think about an open document format if you can. So this again is another thing that's just good for kind of research generally. This doesn't necessarily relate to your data, but kind of thinking about how you're going to find things again. And we've talked about this in different workshops, whether it's kind of time management, or whether it's note making, or any of these things, but just being able to find things again really, really quickly is really important. If you're a part-time student, it might be that you're not working on your project for a little bit and you come back to it and then you can't quite remember where you were working. Or if you're working on a 3-year project, where you are in 2 years' time might be very different to where you were when you first created that data. So think about naming conventions. Think about associated documentation. Again, having some sort of map that just helps explain to you kind of where everything's stored. This is one of the reasons, we often recommend keeping notes on literature in Zotero if you're using that for your references, because then everything's in one place and it's easily keyword searchable, and you're not going through files and files and trying to remember which drive something's stored on. It's all in one place. And this is one of the reasons, like, it's really easy for us to kind of, we're rushed, we're busy, we get a little bit lazy in our file naming conventions, and we just kind of save something with what makes sense to us at that moment in time. So like, conference talk. Well, I know what conference that is because I'm about to deliver my talk next week, but 2 years down the line, you may have been to several conferences. And so conference talk final PowerPoint, you're going to have to open that to find out what's inside it. Supervision meeting notes. Well, I've just been to my supervision. I know what notes they are, but of course, in a couple of months' time, you've probably had several supervisions, and you might want a date stamp on that. And of course, if you open it up to check what's inside, the date stamp will change. And so having a date in the actual title of the document is really valuable, because that fixes it in a particular point in time. With PDFs, we've all downloaded PDFs that have these kind of nonsense titles for us. They mean something to the database that they've come out of. But if you've got loads of those saved on your desktop or in a file, even if your file structure is quite good, more than one of those, you're going to have to keep opening them to find out what's inside. So yeah, think about having a really consistent system in place, and that's another reason to start now on that sort of thing. So think about generating folders, the places where you can put stuff. Think about the types of data or files that you're going to generate, and the sort of prefixes you might want to have to make it clear what sort of information is inside that document. It should be meaningful to you, and I've said also to others. So if you're part of a bigger project in a lab, you might have these file naming conventions, so it's really clear. Of course, if you're working with other people and they're generating documents at the same time, you're going to want to make sure that you're using exactly the same file naming structure. And organizing this data can be physical. You might actually have physical samples, and you're going to need some kind of map so that you remember what you've put where, as well as a really clear labeling system on your physical sample. Or if it's a digital sample, what happens when you're working in the cloud, like we said, and things are backed up automatically and constantly changing. Are you going to need to know, which version you're working on, or if you're adding new data into something, how will you know which one's got the updated data? Is it really clear to you straight away? So it's completely up to you, and having some sort of structure is really important. This is something that came out of the Research Data Office a little while ago. Nicola was a PhD student here in Cambridge and had, I think, worked quite closely with the open access team and had developed a really nice file structure, which is available on their website, and you can download the file structure if you want to. Obviously, you're more than capable of designing your own folder structure, but just thinking about this as a massive project and making sure that you've got separate sections for everything that you're going to be working on. So here, the project management side of things, if there's proposals, finance, if you're constantly generating reports, whether that's for your supervisor or for a funding agency, anything around ethics and governance, you might want to kind of hive that out and keep that in a separate space. Then there's what they've called, experiment one, but that could be different types of data collection on your part. Several of you mentioned different modes of data collection. And then that dissemination, if you're going to be giving presentations, if you're going to be writing this up in other formats than just your thesis, keeping all those things in one place. So taking a massive step back, having that bird's eye view, and there's no harm in creating a folder and it's sitting empty for a while. What's much more difficult is when you only have 2 or 3 folders and then you just get this massive long list of things inside and you need to kind of tease them out, and that just takes you ages. So be proactive wherever you can. And then the actual file name as well, use words that are understandable by more than just you. It's helpful to have short versions of things, but actually just something that really makes sense to you straight away. Try and think about your punctuation. Are you going to use spaces or underscores in the document title? Because then it gets really easy if you just need to A to Z a list and everything is separated in a similar way. Is your numbering system going to start at 1, or are you going to go 01 or 001? Again, it just makes it easier if you need to kind of sort things in their file structure. Like I said, I think having a date is really, really important in that file name, but we can't rely on the date stamp because we might go into something by accident and it completely shifts it in our kind of memory of where something sits. Having version numbers, and I think, again, thinking about when does something qualify for a new version. It's probably worth not just constantly working on the same document again and again and overwriting. Sometimes we do need to go back and look at a previous version, and rather than like really digging into the memory of our computer or looking at to see whether there have been any backups, thinking maybe every week I'm going to create a new version, or if something's changing really rapidly, maybe it's every day for a certain short period of time because you're adding new data in and I just want to go back and look at how it was before. Often we play around with data, we change the way that things look. If you've got a particular layout, save it as a version, save it with a date stamp, be descriptive in the title as to kind of why it's useful presented in that particular format. And then just a consistent order, so you're not messing around with like, is the date at the start, is the date at the end? And there's Queensland University have got something on their LibGuide there that you can have a look at, but basically it's that layout of document titles. So they get really long, but I think it makes them more useful. I mean, I know I don't always give things meaningful titles, and I'll often open 3 or 4 different things that I think are something when they're actually not. Okay, so again, we'll take another pause. I will just put the links to Nicola's folder structure. it's not at all radical. It's just somebody who's actually bothered to kind of share best practice. And I think that's what's really nice, isn't it? You know, when you follow someone's blog or you might watch something on YouTube, when people are sharing best practice, if someone's been there before you and thought about it, that can be really helpful. I've also put the Queensland URL in there as well, if you just want to look at their guidance for file naming structures. Yeah, thanks for that reminder, Georgina. Yes, backing things up offline as well as online as well. And I think, yeah, that's really, really important. And knowing about in the inverse as well, a lot of people just work off the desktop version of Zotero and aren't always aware that there's actually an online version that means that even if their laptop died, they could log in somewhere else and easily access it. So, yeah, thinking both ways about what if there's an issue with an online service and it goes down for a week. As you may have seen that the university library had some technical issues last week, and that just threw out several servers. That meant that we couldn't use certain services. That was a real issue. So in the archives, I know some archives were used to using the online archive for their actual location. So if someone came in and said, "Oh, I'd like to see this particular document," they would go on the online catalogue to find it. And of course, when that was down, they then didn't know where anything was in their archive. So having, yeah, hard copies and online copies are really important. But equally, yeah, if you lost your hard copy, having it backed up somewhere in the cloud is really important. We'll talk about um, different services you might want to use for that in a moment. So some of this can seem quite basic. We've all been naming files for a very long time, but I think it's all about kind of best intentions and best practice. So again, as with so many of these different workshops, it's that opportunity to pause and reflect and just think about if there's ways you can slightly improve your record keeping. Okay, so we're thinking about how we're going to store things, and then we need to think about how we're going to access them. So, said this lots of time already, but making sure that you've got some sort of file with metadata in, so that you can access things. Um, Having enough detail in there as well is really, really important. So that idea of being able to reconstruct the context in which the data was collected and generated, you will know all of this stuff. It's your project. It will be your baby. You will know everything about it from the genesis of the idea through the process, which will be a really lived experience and will be difficult and challenging, and there'll be reasons why there's gaps in your data. You'll know all that. As I said, either at the point at which you're collecting it, and then you might forget some of that later on. So having a record for yourself when you come to write up is really, really important, but also for others should they need to use your data in the long run. There are again, some nice templates on there, some advice from Cornell University and some discipline-specific standards which have come out of the Data Curation Centre as well. But yeah, when in doubt, just having something in a plain text file. Um, Oh, Nicola just asking, yeah, Georgina there about backing up Zotero. We can look at that at the end if you don't have it to hand, Georgina. So yeah, thinking about what you might put in your README file, a little bit more detail there. It's not something we will naturally do, so that might be kind of a helpful checklist, just thinking about what's in there. if there's a license associated things, whether or not it can be shared or not, a full methodological description, doesn't have to be really long, but just including all those different stages, how something, that data is collected, how it's been generated, how it's been processed, and all sorts of other things as well. Units of measurement, definitions for codes. If you've got a kind of shorthand that you've used during the data collection process, make sure that's recorded at that point. And if there's other documentation that goes with that data, so if you're working in a lab, there might be lab notebooks that you can relate to, or there might be questionnaires that perhaps were collected in a paper format and you've just inputted the data, just explaining the kind of whole data landscape, I guess, within that file. Now, we've already talked about this already, that idea of backing up Zotero, and yeah, the importance of backing up your data full stop. So there've been a couple of kind of high profile cases. So in Manchester, a number of years ago, was it 2017, there was a huge fire in the hospital, but it was a research hospital, and as well as obviously the risk to the infrastructure of the building and all the kind of equipment that was in there, there was kind of vital research data that was lost as well. And then there was a attack on Kyoto University a couple of years ago, 2021, I think. Can't quite see from the way I've layered things on this slide. But they lost 77 terabytes, I think, of computer data after, oh, actually, no, yes, it was a software update. That's it. It was a software update. So it wasn't a cyber attack at all. Something just went wrong, and a huge amount of research data was lost, and it just took ages for them to get some of this back, and some of it they couldn't. I'm just scrolling down here. Yeah, there were over 2 days. It says it was confirmed that 34 million files from 14 research groups were lost due to a bug in a backup program. So there's some things that just shouldn't go wrong that do go wrong, and that people lose a lot of data. So really needing to think about that. You kind of assume I'm safe, I'm secure, I'm going to really look after my laptop and make sure it doesn't go anywhere. But we do need to just have that consideration of what would happen if something massive took place. So there's a lot of stuff we can't personally guard against there, obviously, but thinking about those kind of worst case scenarios. And there's a funny little video here, which again is from the research, the Data Curation Center, I think, just a kind of wry look at what can go wrong if we haven't actually thought about how we back stuff up. So I was just quickly looking at my notes here, and yeah, there's a recent report from the government, 2023 cybersecurity breaches, which is obviously something that we're very aware of now. Those other two examples were actually kind of, I suppose, kind of hardware failures, really, that servers were lost, or backups went wrong, but also that 50% of education institutions reported experiencing breaches or attacks at least weekly, and 6 in 10 higher education institutions, there's an impact of in terms of a loss of data or loss of money. So backing up your data essentially is really, really important. That's what I was saying, a very long way round of doing that. But yeah, just thinking, if you have got any analog data, so if you were collecting kind of paper surveys, or you had anything that was kind of written and documented, even your research notes. So if your data, if you're an English student, for example, and you're going off to archives and making loads of kind of handwritten notes, you need to think about backing that up. So that might be scanning paper documents, might be taking photos of them, and then having some sort of cloud solution in addition to the paper. Even if you really kind of still want to work with the paper, you've got that kind of backup at some point. Thinking, finding out what your kind of departmental backup is. When you're kind of logging on, are there ways of kind of retrieving data? Have you got the kind of technical expertise within your department to kind of go back and retrieve data if by accident everything on the cloud, you hit shift delete and it all disappeared and you hadn't realized for a few days? How far back could you go if you needed to? Obviously, external drives are really, really risky in terms of, really, we don't recommend that you would use a memory stick. And if you do have a kind of hard external drive, thinking about where you might be safe, keeping that, making sure it's always kept separate from your laptop, because obviously if your laptop bag gets stolen and all your backups are kind of kept in there, then that doesn't make much sense in terms of security. And we've talked already about this issue of when things are constantly syncing all the time, it's easy to lose things. In terms of other issues around backing up your data, yeah, you need to think about how frequently you do it. If it's a manual process, if this is something you need to kind of duplicate or save as, or like we said, if you're scanning paper, the more something's changing or the more data you're generating, the more frequently you need to do it. So it's going to vary during the course of your research process. There might be times when you're doing daily checks. It might be that actually every couple of weeks is fine if you're not generating too much new information. Yeah, how much would you be willing to lose? And I think that's a really nice way of thinking about it, rather than seeing it as a kind of chore, thinking, are there certain things that I could allow to go or not? Is if it's all really safe and secure, do I need to think about different ways of backing it up? And as I said, yeah, always make sure it's in two physical locations. So often there are kind of questions about, what should I use to back up my data? So there's lots of information on the UIS about this. We talked before about kind of high impact data. So that's the kind of level of kind of security around personal or sensitive data. There's kind of very high impact data is the kind of very top level, level 3, and then, or is that 4? And then levels 2 and 3 of sort of high impact data. And the recommendation from UIS is that OneDrive is suitable for that. So using that because it's supported by the university. Google Drive, even the kind of institutional license that we have with Google, so where you can kind of log in with your CRS and when you do, you see that little University of Cambridge badge, it is still Google behind the whole thing. So although it is endorsed by the university, the suggestion, and if you follow some of these links from UIS, is that it's only suitable for medium impact data. So let me see if I can go through here. Yeah, so the guidelines on university data security classifications, very high impact, medium impact, which does include personal data as defined in the UK GDPR, unreserved business meetings, those sorts of things, information of a non-personal nature, but stuff becomes high impact pretty quickly, especially if you want to kind of limit who has access to data. So special category data, and we've already mentioned the difference between personal and special category data, would be considered high impact. And so, yeah, the suggestion there is that it's not suitable to use Google Drive for that. Oops, sorry, clicked ahead there. So yeah, so those are the things it's not suitable for. So have a think about that. I think one of the big issues also is that data that's subject to specific contractual agreement that prohibits storage outside the EU. So just thinking about where Google is storing its data, that these servers are held all over the world, and there might be restrictions on what you can actually do with your data and where you can store it. As well. And so this is a little bit more detail on that. These are from Google's terms of service, which we all probably click and say, yeah, happy, really happy with your new terms of service. But actually, if you look at the small print, there are some things there that might raise a few eyebrows. That Google, by using it, you are allowing it to host, reproduce, distribute, communicate, and use your content. So that is quite a shock to a lot of people. In theory, it's to kind of help you, and that is true. It's really beneficial, isn't it? That wherever you go, you can upload your profile. If you use Google on a new computer or a new phone, you can just map across all your kind of search preferences and things like that. But it also allows them to publish, publicly perform, and publicly display your content if it's visible to other people. So if you're not really, really careful what you're doing with your data, Google has the right to kind of reuse it and to display your content. There are issues around reformatting and translating what you're creating online. So yeah, just being kind of aware of some of those things. In theory, they're not going to go through and just take your research data and put it, openly on the web. But that license does give them the right to do quite a lot with the data that we're using and that we're storing potentially on Google Drive. So we just need to think about that. Okay, I will put a few links into the chat. But yeah, just think about what is your strategy? How frequently do you think you might need to back up your data at different points of the research process, particularly when you're in the kind of really active research data collection phase? How much data can you anticipate that you might need? And on one of those slides before, if you're in the sciences and you're producing huge amounts of data, you might need to buy some storage space. And yeah, where are your backups going to live? And if you don't know, that's fine. That can just be kind of one of the questions that comes out of today's session that you might want to just double check that with your department. So let me just pull out a few of those links. So yeah, we've got the storage overview there at the bottom. Um, and particularly looking at kind of cloud-based options and making a comparison between the different services that are available to you and that are supported by UIS. And I think that's really important, just to think about trying to use services wherever possible, where they are endorsed and supported by the university, so that if something goes wrong, you can easily go to people for a little bit of help. There's the Google Terms of Service there. A little bit more information from UIS about the different workspaces you can use and some of the limitations around using Google. The different data security classes, like we mentioned, that kind of the high impact data, and the medium impact data, kind of where would your data fall, which category would it fall into, and just some of the options that are available through UIS in terms of data and file storage there. So lots to explore. Again, I know you're not going to have opportunity to go into too much depth today, but I'll just give you a minute or two. Georgina, your question, does two different OneDrives count as two different locations, i.e. work and university OneDrive? I would think so. Yeah, I would think that they would be stored differently, so that if there was, an attack on the university and your university OneDrive went down, yes, you would still be able to access another one. Um, I don't know the answer to that question. So Georgie has asked, do I need to tell my participants of the places that my data is stored? But I do think, for example, with Google, like we said, if it's being stored outside the EU, then where it's being stored may not have the same data regulations as you kind of already flagged in terms of kind of your data participants. So I think it might be reassuring for people to know where it is stored, or that might be a requirement of some of the sorts of data that you are collecting, that it has to be stored within the UK, so it's then or the EU, so it's subject to same data protection regulations. But whether you need to tell them, I don't know. So that might be a good one to ask kind of peers who have collected similar data in the past, or I can have a dig around and have a look for you actually on when we looked at those kind of the consent forms and getting consent, the sort of the kind of checklist. So that's a really good question. I'll have a look. Okay, so slowly, hopefully this kind of short data management plan is taking shape. Hopefully you got something in all the boxes, even if it's just big questions. But yeah, we're moving through it. So there's a couple of a few more things just very quickly to consider at the end here. Yeah, how will you actually kind of access the data that you're creating, and kind of where you physically will be when you're creating? Like we said, try to avoid methods where you're accessing something remotely, whether that's kind of physically having a USB in your hand or emailing things to yourself is really, really bad practice. So just making sure you've got kind of really secure logins and that you can access the data from wherever you are. Sometimes, you are restricted and you can only access things, in a lab, for example, and therefore, you just can't take the data away with you. Yeah, thinking about how you're going to transfer and access is really, really important. So like we said, which file you're working on, that's something that's really dangerous, isn't it? When you email something, rather than attaching it as a link in an email, if you actually stick it as an attachment, or if you were going to send something to a supervisor, and some kind of comments were coming back, and then it was like a to and fro, you might lose track of kind of which version you're working on. And so therefore it can lead to data loss or kind of confusion, or yeah, just time lost because you're kind of rebuilding, thinking, I think this is an old version, but I'm not quite sure where I'm up to. Yeah, try not to kind of overwrite files, and yes, just kind of having a process in place means that you're not going to accidentally share confidential files as well. So having a single method of kind of remote access, if you can give somebody permissions to access a particular file, that might be a safer way of sharing those documents rather than attaching them or handing them to somebody physically as well. So collaboration and access, this is something that is very different across the disciplines. There will be some people who will only ever really need to share what they're doing with their supervisor. Others might be working as part of large teams that may be intra or inter universities. So there might be other institutions that are involved in this. And in those cases, you really do need to kind of have really clear plans and protocols to make sure everybody is sharing in exactly the same way. Again, flagging up issues there about not sharing things by email. If you have got a VPN that you can kind of securely remotely access into a computer, then that might be a kind of safer way of doing things. The Open Science Framework is a particular website which is really useful for kind of sharing data in a kind of safe way. That way you're not kind of sending people off to different resources. So that's a kind of secure resource. If I see if I can bring it out now. Yeah, so you can discover research in there. It's open, but it's also enables you to kind of collect and analyze your data when you're working across different institutions, because that is one of the big issues, not being able to necessarily give people access to the place that you're storing your data. Yeah, you might need to do a secure file transfer with another collaborator in another institution, but there could also be cloud storage solutions that will enable you both to kind of access exactly the same physical space. And in that case, as we said, you need to be really clear what it was you were working on. I'm going to keep going, and you can perhaps roll this into the next have a go, but there is a box there thinking about whether or not you're going to have collaborators, whether you need to share data even just with your supervisor, even if there aren't other individuals that you're working with. And if you're going to do that, how are you going to exchange the files? So I'll copy and paste that and stick that into the next have a go. And then this is the bit that often gets forgotten, which is sort of long-term storage. And best research practice is that it should be kind of 10 years after the date of completion of the project. That you should be able to go back to it, so that if there are kind of queries around it, if anyone else wants to interrogate the data that you've generated, if you're publishing the findings of your research, that would be best practice. It's not really acceptable to say, actually, I got rid of all my data. Sorry, that's gone now. And kind of how you do that there's going to be a number of different factors that impact on that, whether or not there are costs involved in the storage. What will you do if you leave Cambridge? So it's all very well we say, you must use all these services that are supported by UIS, and then of course you go to somewhere else, you go to another institution, and then you can't get back into, you've lost your login and you can't get back to your data. So then you might have to think in the long term about having somewhere safe and secure to store it that sits out with the university. Of course, if you do keep it and there is a freedom of information request put in, then you have a legal right to supply that. If you haven't got that data, then you can't. So that's something else to kind of bear in mind. And again, just making sure that the final data that you keep is really clearly anonymized. There might be reasons why you've collected identifiers when you're actually doing the analysis for your own reference, but the data that you archive might be slightly different to the data that you were actually working on when you analyzed something. Again, there's statements of records management practice. If you're funded by anyone, there will be particular requirements about what you do with that data and how long you keep it and how accessible it is. So do look into that. And then this kind of ties up all these messages that we've been saying throughout the whole presentation, but that if you haven't got supporting data, you're just making a claim. So if you say that you did some research and that these were your findings and you publish those findings, if you can't back it up with data, you can't kind of prove that that was the case. And so there have been a couple of instances where people have just made up data and published findings that they thought that's what they wanted to happen in their research process, but it's not what actually happened, and people have therefore queried it. So I think, yeah, being confident in your abilities to kind of prove any claims that you're making is a really good thing to do, and to retain the data for that very purpose. If you do decide to share a data set, then that means that other people can cite it, just like they would cite a journal article or a book chapter or a book that you might write. So you can share that. You can get increased citations by people reusing that data and citing that data. You can enable new publications to come out of it. That's obviously, if it's publicly funded research, that's saving the research being repeated and being done again unnecessarily. And like we said, you can verify the claims that you're making. I've included the link there that if you are funded, you really do need to check this, because it may be mandated that your data is made available publicly. If you need to do that, then the university system is called Symplectic. That's a piece of that's the service that enables you to kind of put your publications and to put your data in there, and there's really clear support and guidance to do that. Apollo, which you may have used, is our institutional repository, and that's like the front end of Symplectic. That is how you would access other things that have been deposited in there, and that's kind of how the data can be accessed as well. So by doing that, putting it through Symplectic, that's the best way to make it openly available, rather than kind of finding your own way of doing that, and that will be stored indefinitely on there. So as well as thinking about issues of collaboration, think about whether or not you want to share your data, whether or not it's mandated or not. And I know that this doesn't apply to everybody, so that's why I'm kind of conflating the two. So just taking a few more minutes at the end of the session to fill in the last few boxes on that short data management plan. The answer might be no to both of them, and that's fine. But if you're not sure, then again, flag that up, put a star next to it, and ask your supervisor, or do a bit of research from your funding council, and find out what peers are doing as well. And Nicola, I've just put a link in the chat to how you can back up your Zotero library. So first of all, it kind of, if everything's being saved actually onto your computer, there'll be a folder where all that data is going and things like the PDFs and all those kind of links. You can then drag that if it's onto an external drive, something like that, or just even duplicating the location, making sure it's clear it's a backup location, but just that, so you've got it somewhere else on your computer in case you accidentally delete that folder. But you should also sync it with the cloud, like I said, and there's just, I think it's now in the top right, there's just like a little 2 arrows. Oh, thanks, Georgina. Um, yeah, just making sure you're constantly syncing your library. It should be set up to sync automatically. But in some cases, that's turned off. And then just regularly log into the online version of Zotero and just check that it looks the same. Just check that everything is naturally syncing and going over. There's slightly limited functionality on the online version, but it would still have everything in there that you would need. Okay, so there's just a few slides left to go and then we'll be finished. So today you've completed a really short light touch data management plan. If you need to, you might want to create a longer research data management plan. So the Digital Curation Center is great for that, and you can go through to the data management plan online website, which is really, really helpful. So if I just connect through to that, am I sharing my screen? If you just pop in the chat, can you see when I go on to that, or do you just still see the slides?
The slides.
Oh, okay, that's fine. All right, so I'll stop sharing. Okay, so this is the Data Management Plan online tool, and it's through the DCC's Digital Curation Centre. You log in and you can identify yourself as University of Cambridge, which gives you access to kind of other plans that have been created by people in the University of Cambridge. So I've just started one here. And it literally, takes you step by step through the whole process. The overview, writing your plan, kind of, this is the page I really, really like. So it's got all these kind of little drop downs about all the questions that you need to consider. You type it in there, you can include links. I think that's just a really, really nice tool. Even if you decide not to fill it in on here, again, just all these questions. And it's a lot of the stuff we've talked about today, but it's just done in a really, really nice format. There's even the ability to kind of share. You could add collaborators there, and it's something that most supervisors, I hope, would be aware of, so that you could kind of share it if you needed to. So I definitely recommend going to the Data Management Plan online. Just step you back through. Yeah. Where the drop down has obscured. Not sure what's happened to it there. If we go back to yeah, so there's the Data Curation Center. So if that's all you remember is the DCC, just straight away from that homepage, explore DMP online now, sign up. Yeah, as we said, it's free because it links you into the university. So you can scroll down and just see other people are working on their plans right now, and you get access to those as well. So that's a really helpful tool, I think. And then the final thing I just want to say is, there's been a huge amount of talk. Obviously, AI has to creep into every single presentation that goes on at the moment. In terms of kind of data analysis, obviously, it's really, really tempting to use it. I know we said we weren't going to talk about analysis today, but it seems to kind of overlap with some of the other things that we've been talking about. Yes, in theory, it can kind of automate and streamline some of the data handling that you might be doing. That might reduce the risk of human error. But at the same time, I just wanted to kind of flag up the last 2 points, and that is that if you are inputting any data into AI for analysis purposes, you have to be aware that that might be putting it into the data set that large language model or whatever is using on a regular basis. So therefore the data you're putting in could easily be spat out to somebody else. So it kind of completely breaches all these issues around security. You might be really careful in how you collected the data and how you're storing it, and then you put it into there, and then that's a massive data breach. So please don't do that unless you've absolutely checked or you're very confident with the sort of data that you're inputting, that there's no risk of that being kind of identifying kind of who you are, all the sort of research has been doing, but particularly your research participants. As you would have been aware, people are sort of chucking all sorts of text in there. And then, yeah, that's then being used as that kind of core, that training body of research that the large language model might then stick out at the other end. There are obviously there are language models that you can train on your own set of data. So you would really have to look into the security of those and whether or not that was safe if it was just using your own data and you were just querying your own data set. But just think about it before you go any further. And of course, if you are asking it to draw out themes or topics from your data, there's all sorts of bias in there. And I know we're not free of bias, but it's difficult to know what the bias is that the language model is working on. So that was just a kind of final warning, just because it seems to be cropping up more and more when I was kind of looking at things around research data management. And then there's just a very long list of links at the end. A lot of them are the ones that have occurred throughout the presentation, but there's a couple of few extras thrown in there as well. There's lots of training available from the university, whether these are kind of self-paced training modules or actual courses that you can go on, particularly if you've got concerns around data protection and things like that, and you just want a little bit more information on that from someone who's a specialist, unlike me. So I am going to stop sharing now, and I will also stop the recording as well and just give you a chance to ask any questions that you might have.